There is a quiet kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't dominate rooms or demand attention. It listens, absorbs, feels, holds. Many of you in this room know that power intimately, because you have lived your lives as emotional first responders. You sensed the mood before words were spoken. You adjusted yourself so others could feel safe. You learned early that love was something you earned by being available, understanding, patient, and endlessly forgiving. And for a long time that seemed to work, until one day it didn't. Until the moment you paused, pulled back, or simply said, "I can't anymore." And suddenly, the people who were comfortable in your constant presence began to panic. Not because you became cruel, but because you became unavailable. Today we are exploring why that panic happens, what it reveals about human attachment, and what it means when an empath finally chooses themselves. Empaths are not born to serve, but many are trained to do so. Often without realizing it, they grow up in environments where emotional attunement becomes a survival skill. When a child learns that peace in the home depends on how well they read the room, how quickly they sense tension, or how effectively they soothe distress, their nervous system adapts. They become hyper-aware, not because they are weak, but because awareness once kept them safe. Over time, this sensitivity turns into a role. They become the one who understands without being told, the one who listens without interrupting, the one who carries emotions that are not theirs to carry. As adults, empaths often continue this pattern, believing it is simply who they are. They take pride in being dependable, emotionally present, and endlessly patient. But beneath that identity is a deeper conditioning, the belief that their value lies in their usefulness. When someone is upset, they feel responsible. When someone is distant, they search themselves for what they did wrong. When someone is hurting, they move toward the pain, even if it costs them their own well-being. This is not empathy as a choice, this is empathy as a compulsion. People around empaths unconsciously sense this regulation. They feel calmer in their presence. They feel heard, grounded, and emotionally held. Over time, this creates an imbalance. The empath becomes the emotional stabilizer in the relationship, the one who absorbs anxiety, diffuses conflict, and makes discomfort tolerable. Others may not consciously recognize what is happening, but their nervous systems learn to rely on it. The empath's presence becomes a kind of emotional infrastructure, invisible, essential, and taken for granted. The problem arises when regulation flows in only one direction. When empaths are always the ones holding space, few people ask who is holding space for them. Because empaths are skilled at coping quietly, their exhaustion is often overlooked. Their silence is misread as strength. Their resilience becomes an excuse for neglect. And slowly, without intention or malice, people begin to offload emotional responsibility onto them. Not because they are asked to, but because they always have. When an empath finally stops being available, it disrupts this system. The panic that follows is not about losing a person, it is about losing regulation. The calm that others outsource suddenly disappears, and they are left alone with emotions they never learned to manage themselves. Anxiety rises, confusion sets in. Accusations may follow. You've changed. You're selfish. You don't care anymore. These reactions are not a reflection of the empath's failure. They are a revelation of the dependency that was always there. It is important to understand that this conditioning was never about generosity alone. It was about safety. Empaths often learned that being needed was safer than being authentic. That being helpful was safer than having needs. That staying emotionally available prevented conflict, rejection, or abandonment. Over time, the nervous system confuses self-sacrifice with connection. Saying no feels dangerous. Rest feels undeserved. Boundaries feel like betrayal, so when an empath pauses, withdraws, or chooses themselves, their body may flood with guilt and fear. Even when the decision is healthy, it feels wrong, because it contradicts a lifetime of conditioning. And when others react with panic or anger, it reinforces the old belief that setting limits causes harm. But what is actually happening is not harm, it is withdrawal from an unhealthy role. Empathy was never meant to replace mutuality. Regulation was never meant to be one-sided. Healthy relationships allow emotions to move back and forth, not drain in one direction. When empaths stop regulating everyone else, they are not becoming cold. They are becoming balanced. They are allowing others to develop their own emotional capacity instead of borrowing theirs. This moment, when an empath stops being available, is not the collapse of love. It is the exposure of truth. It shows who is connected to the empath as a person, and who is attached to the function they provided. It forces a reckoning, not just for others but for the empath themselves, who must confront the question they were never encouraged to ask. Who am I when I am not managing everyone else's emotions? And what might become possible if my empathy finally includes me? Availability often begins as kindness, but over time it quietly transforms into an expectation. Not a spoken one, not something anyone formally agrees to, but a psychological agreement that forms through repetition. When you are always reachable, always responsive, always willing to listen, people begin to assume you will continue to be so. Each time you show up without being asked, each time you sacrifice your own needs to meet someone else's emotional moment, the pattern strengthens. What started as generosity slowly hardens into an unspoken contract. You will be there no matter what it costs you. This contract is rarely acknowledged because it benefits others without requiring conscious responsibility. People don't say, "I depend on you to regulate me," but their behavior reveals it. They call when they are overwhelmed, not when you are. They vent but don't inquire. They expect understanding but struggle to offer it. And because the empath rarely complains, the imbalance feels normal. Silence is mistaken for consent. Endurance is mistaken for willingness. Empaths often participate in this contract without realizing it exists. Many were conditioned early to equate love with availability. If they were present enough, helpful enough, emotionally flexible enough, they could prevent conflict or abandonment. Over time, availability became a form of emotional currency. It bought connection, it bought acceptance, it bought safety. And so they learned to keep themselves open even when they were depleted, because closing off felt more threatening than exhaustion. The danger of an unspoken contract is that it removes choice. When availability is expected, saying no is no longer neutral, it feels like a violation. The moment an empath pulls back, others may feel confused or betrayed, even though no explicit promise was ever made. "You used to be there for me," becomes the accusation, as if past generosity created permanent obligation. But generosity that turns into obligation is no longer generosity, it is emotional labor taken for granted. What fuels this dynamic is emotional convenience. When someone knows there is always a person who will listen, absorb, and reassure, they have little incentive to develop those skills themselves. The empath becomes the shortcut around discomfort. Instead of learning how to self-regulate, reflect, or tolerate emotional pain, others externalize that work. And because the empath is capable, responsive, and compassionate, the system continues uninterrupted. The panic that arises when availability ends is the panic of dependency being exposed. Suddenly, the emotional safety net is gone. The person who used to stabilize the environment is no longer accessible, and the feelings that were quietly outsourced come rushing back. This is when accusations often surface. The empath is labeled distant, selfish, uncaring, not because they have become those things, but because the contract has been broken, and the other party never learned how to function without it. For the empath, breaking this contract can feel deeply unsettling. There is often an internal conflict between relief and guilt. Relief because the nervous system finally gets a pause. Guilt because the old conditioning insists that withdrawal equals harm. Many empaths were taught, directly or indirectly, that their needs were secondary, that being available was a moral virtue, and that prioritizing themselves would cause damage. So even when stepping back is necessary, it can feel like a personal failure. But an unspoken contract that requires self-erasure is not a healthy bond. Real connection allows renegotiation. It allows limits. It allows availability to be a choice rather than a duty. When an empath stops being constantly available, they are not ending love, they are redefining it. They are shifting from compulsive giving to conscious relating. This shift often reveals who can adapt and who cannot. Some people will adjust, learn, and meet the empath in a more balanced way. Others will resist, because the relationship was never about mutual presence, only about access. And that realization can be painful, but it is also clarifying. It shows the difference between being valued and being used, between being loved and being relied upon. Availability, when freely chosen, is a gift. When assumed, it becomes a burden. Empaths do not lose their compassion when they step back, they reclaim it. By breaking the unspoken contract, they give themselves permission to exist not just as a resource, but as a whole human being, with limits, needs, and a nervous system that deserves care as much as anyone else. Emotional dependency rarely announces itself as dependency. It often disguises itself as closeness, loyalty, history, or comfort. It lives in phrases like, "We've always talked like this," or "You're the only one who understands me." On the surface, these sound like intimacy. But beneath them is a quiet avoidance of self-responsibility. When someone consistently relies on another person to process feelings, make sense of chaos, or soothe inner distress, familiarity becomes a cover for imbalance. In relationships with empaths, this pattern develops subtly. There is no dramatic moment where one person decides to lean and the other agrees to carry. It happens through repetition. One person shares, the other listens. One person unravels, the other stabilizes. Over time, the roles solidify. The empath becomes the emotional home base, the place where feelings go to be organized and calmed. And because this dynamic feels normal, even loving, it is rarely questioned. Familiarity is powerful because it reduces anxiety. When people know how a relationship will function, even if it is unhealthy, the predictability itself feels safe. Emotional dependency thrives in that safety. The dependent person does not have to risk learning new skills, confronting uncomfortable emotions, or tolerating uncertainty. They already know what will happen. The empath will be there, will understand, will soften the edges of their experience. This predictability creates comfort, but it also creates stagnation. What makes this dependency hard to see is that it doesn't look like weakness. The dependent person may appear functional, independent in many areas of life, even confident. But emotionally, there is a reliance that remains unexamined. They outsource reflection, they outsource grounding, they outsource reassurance. And because the empath is capable, emotionally literate, and responsive, the system works until it doesn't. Empaths often mistake this dependency for connection. Being needed can feel validating, especially for those who learned early that usefulness equaled worth. When someone consistently turns to them, it reinforces the belief that they matter. But being needed is not the same as being known. Dependency does not require seeing the empath fully, it only requires access to what they provide. Their presence becomes functional rather than relational. When an empath begins to pull back, the reaction is rarely curiosity. It is often panic. The panic is not rooted in loss of love, but in loss of regulation. The familiar pattern has been disrupted. The dependent person suddenly feels uncontained, unsettled, emotionally exposed. And instead of recognizing this as an invitation to grow, they may interpret it as rejection. Familiarity had masked the dependency so completely that its absence feels like abandonment. This is where confusion often arises. The empath may think, I didn't leave, I just needed space. But for someone who relied on that constant emotional availability, space feels like collapse. The relationship had been serving as an emotional scaffolding, and when that scaffolding is removed even temporarily, everything feels unstable. Anger, blame, or dramatic reactions are not uncommon in this phase because dependency resists disruption. It is important to understand that emotional dependency is not usually intentional or malicious. Most people are not consciously using others. They are repeating what feels familiar, often learned in early attachment experiences. If someone grew up without consistent emotional support, they may cling to it wherever they find it. If they were never taught how to sit with their own feelings, they will seek someone who can do it with them or for them. But unexamined dependency limits both people. The dependent person never develops emotional resilience, and the empath never experiences reciprocity. The relationship remains frozen in roles that no longer serve growth. And because familiarity feels safe, both may resist change even when the cost is exhaustion, resentment, or loss of self. When empaths stop being available, they are not breaking intimacy, they are revealing its true structure. They are exposing whether the connection was built on mutual presence or on emotional outsourcing. This moment can be deeply uncomfortable, but it is also honest. It shows what was real and what was habitual. For the empath, recognizing this pattern can be painful. It often brings grief, not just for the relationship, but for the time and energy given without return. There may be a reckoning with how often familiarity was mistaken for love, how often consistency was mistaken for care. But this awareness is also liberating. It allows the empath to redefine connection not as constant availability, but as shared responsibility. True closeness does not require one person to hold all the weight. It does not collapse when boundaries appear. It adapts, stretches, and deepens. Emotional dependency, by contrast, cannot survive change because it was never built on equality. When familiarity is stripped away, what remains tells the truth about the bond, and that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Boundaries are often misunderstood as rejection, especially by those who never learned to feel safe within themselves. When an empath introduces a limit, it does not arrive in a relational vacuum. It lands on unhealed attachment wounds, old fears, and unfinished emotional development. To someone who equates closeness with constant access, a boundary feels like abandonment. Not because the empath has disappeared, but because the emotional system that relied on them has been disrupted. For many people, boundaries activate early experiences of loss. If care was inconsistent or conditional growing up, any change in availability can trigger the nervous system into alarm. The body does not register the boundary as a healthy adjustment, it registers danger. Fight, flight, or freeze responses emerge, often disguised as anger, accusations, or emotional withdrawal. The empath becomes the perceived threat, even though they are simply trying to protect their own well-being. Unhealed individuals often confuse boundaries with punishment. When access is reduced, they assume it is a response to wrongdoing or a sign of disapproval. What did I do? Becomes the underlying question. And if no clear answer is found, the mind fills the gap with stories of rejection. This internal narrative can quickly turn outward, framing the empath as cold, changed, or uncaring. The boundary is no longer seen as self-respect, it is seen as betrayal. What makes this especially painful is that empaths often set boundaries gently. They explain, they reassure, they soften the edges. But to a nervous system wired for abandonment, reassurance does little. The issue is not the tone or the intention, it is the loss of regulation. The empath was serving as an external stabilizer, and when that stabilizer steps back, the internal chaos that was being managed externally comes into full view. This is why some people react dramatically to even small limits. A delayed response, a declined request, a need for space, these can provoke outsized emotional reactions. The intensity is not about the present moment, it is about the past being reactivated. The boundary touches a wound that predates the relationship, and instead of recognizing the wound, the unhealed person defends against the pain by blaming the one who triggered it. For the empath, this reaction can be deeply confusing. They may think, I'm still here. Why does this feel like abandonment to you? But abandonment is not defined by physical presence, it is defined by emotional access. When someone has relied on constant emotional availability, any reduction can feel like being left behind, even if the relationship continues in a healthier form. This dynamic creates a powerful pressure on empaths to abandon their boundaries. Seeing someone else in distress can activate their conditioning to rescue, explain, or reverse the limit. Guilt rises. Doubt creeps in. They may question whether their needs are legitimate or whether they are being too harsh. This is how unhealed attachment pulls people back into self-sacrifice, not through force, but through emotional consequence. Boundaries, however, are not acts of withdrawal, they are acts of definition. They clarify where one person ends and another begins. For those who never developed a strong sense of self, this clarity can feel terrifying. If identity was built around closeness, enmeshment, or being needed, then a boundary threatens the very structure of how they relate. Panic emerges because the old relational map no longer works. When empaths hold their boundaries despite the backlash, something important happens. They stop participating in emotional enmeshment. They allow others to feel their feelings without rushing in to fix them. This is not cruelty, it is respect. It respects the other person's capacity to grow, even if that growth is uncomfortable. Not everyone can tolerate this shift. Some relationships will strain or break under the weight of boundaries, revealing that they were sustained not by mutual care, but by access and control. This can be painful to witness, but it is also informative. It shows which connections are resilient enough to evolve and which were dependent on the empath's self-erasure. For those who are healing, boundaries eventually stop feeling like abandonment and start feeling like safety. They become the structure within which real intimacy can exist. But for the unhealed, boundaries will always feel like loss, because they are being asked to do something they were never taught to do whole themselves. And that is why, when empaths stop being endlessly available, people who are not yet healed often panic, not because love has ended, but because avoidance no longer has a place to hide. Many people grow up learning that empathy is something you receive, not something you practice. They experience it as relief, someone understanding them, making space for their emotions, softening their pain. Over time, this experience becomes associated with care itself. So when they encounter an empath, someone who naturally attunes, listens deeply, and responds with sensitivity, they don't just feel supported, they feel entitled. Without realizing it, empathy becomes confused with obligation. This confusion develops quietly. The empath offers understanding freely, often without being asked. They notice shifts in tone, unspoken needs, emotional undercurrents. They respond before discomfort has time to surface. For the other person, this feels seamless, almost magical. Needs are met before they are named. Tension dissolves without confrontation, and because it feels so natural, it begins to feel expected. Empathy stops being a gift and starts being assumed. Obligation enters when empathy is no longer met with reciprocity. When one person is consistently understood and the other is consistently adapting, the relationship tilts. The empath becomes responsible not just for listening, but for maintaining emotional equilibrium. If the other person is upset, it is the empath's job to soothe. If there is conflict, it is the empath's job to de-escalate. And if the empath is struggling, there is often little room for that reality to exist. What makes this dynamic so persistent is that it is rarely challenged. Empaths often hesitate to express their own needs, fearing they will burden others or disrupt harmony. They may minimize their feelings, rationalize neglect, or tell themselves that being understanding is simply who they are. Meanwhile, others grow accustomed to being centered. Their emotional world becomes the default focus, not because they demand it explicitly, but because the empath provides it implicitly. Over time, empathy becomes transactional in disguise. The unspoken rule becomes, you understand me, so I don't have to change. You make room for me, so I don't have to make room for you. You forgive quickly, so I don't have to reflect deeply. This is not a conscious bargain, but it functions like one. The empath's compassion becomes the lubricant that keeps the relationship running without friction. When an empath begins to pull back, this illusion is shattered. The other person may feel shocked, even offended. I thought you cared, becomes the accusation, as if care were proven only through endless availability. Empathy, in their mind, had become a duty. And when that duty is no longer performed, it feels like a moral failure. The empath is no longer seen as human, but as a resource that has stopped working. This is where guilt is often weaponized. The empath may be told they are selfish, cold, or changed. Their need for space is reframed as a lack of love. This reaction reveals the core misunderstanding. Empathy was never meant to override consent. Understanding someone does not mean absorbing their emotional burden indefinitely. Compassion does not require self-neglect. Empathy without boundaries is not kindness, it is erasure. When empathy turns into obligation, the empath disappears. Their inner world becomes secondary, sometimes invisible. And because this disappearance happens gradually, it is often only noticed when the empath stops performing the role. The withdrawal feels sudden to others, even though it has been building internally for a long time. For the empath, reclaiming empathy as a choice rather than a duty can be disorienting. They may feel like they are withholding something essential. But what they are actually doing is restoring balance. They are allowing empathy to flow in both directions, or not at all. They are recognizing that understanding someone else does not obligate them to remain in situations that drain or diminish them. Healthy relationships do not demand empathy as proof of loyalty. They allow it to be offered freely and received gratefully. They recognize that care is not measured by how much one person endures, but by how both people respond to each other's humanity. When empaths stop confusing empathy with obligation, they do not become less caring, they become more honest. And that honesty reshapes every relationship it touches. Power in relationships is often imagined as dominance, control, or authority, but some of the most influential power dynamics are quiet and invisible. They live in who adapts, who explains, who soothes, and who carries emotional weight. In many relationships involving empaths, power does not look like control. It looks like dependence disguised as normalcy. Because the empath is the one adjusting, they rarely appear powerful. Yet when they withdraw, the imbalance is suddenly exposed. For a long time, the empath's flexibility keeps the relationship stable. They bend their schedule, their tone, their needs. They anticipate reactions and manage outcomes. This adaptability creates comfort for others, but it also creates a hidden hierarchy. One person is responsible for maintaining emotional order, while the other is free to exist without that responsibility. This is not power through force, it is power through exemption. The invisibility of this dynamic is what allows it to persist. Because the empath is choosing to adapt, it doesn't look like they are being controlled. Because others are not issuing demands, it doesn't look like they are exerting power. But power exists wherever there is an unequal distribution of emotional labor. One nervous system is doing the work for two. When an empath stops being available, this imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The person who relied on that emotional labor suddenly feels destabilized. Confusion turns into frustration. Frustration turns into blame. The reaction often sounds like, "Why are you doing this?" Or, "You're making things difficult." What is really being expressed is the loss of an unacknowledged advantage. The relationship no longer functions the way it used to, because the unseen support has been removed. This moment reveals something important. The empath was not just participating in the relationship, they were propping it up. Their withdrawal does not create dysfunction, it reveals it. The system was never balanced, only maintained. And once maintenance stops, the cracks show. For the empath, recognizing this can be unsettling. It challenges the belief that they were simply being kind or loving. It introduces the uncomfortable realization that their self-sacrifice may have enabled others to avoid growth. This does not mean the empath acted with ill intent, but it does mean their role had consequences. By always accommodating, they unintentionally reinforced a dynamic where their needs mattered less. Power dynamics become clearest at the point of resistance. When the empath says no, sets a limit, or steps back, the response they receive is instructive. If the reaction is curiosity, adjustment, or respect, the relationship has elasticity. If the reaction is panic, anger, or guilt-inducing behavior, the power imbalance is being challenged. The system is pushing back to restore the old order. This pushback can take many forms: emotional appeals, moral arguments, reminders of past sacrifices. These are not always conscious attempts at control, but they function as such. They are efforts to pull the empath back into their regulating role. The message beneath them is clear. Your withdrawal is unacceptable because it disrupts what we have come to rely on. What makes this especially difficult is that empaths often internalize this backlash. They may feel responsible for the discomfort their boundary creates. They may question whether they are being unreasonable. This self-doubt is part of the power dynamic. When one person is conditioned to prioritize harmony over self-truth, resistance feels wrong even when it is necessary. As the empath maintains their boundary, something shifts. The invisible power they held, the power of regulation, accommodation, and emotional labor, becomes visible precisely because it is no longer being exercised. Others are forced to confront their own capacity, or lack thereof, to manage emotions, communicate needs, and tolerate discomfort. This can lead to growth or it can lead to rupture. Withdrawal is not an act of dominance, it is an act of rebalancing. It does not seize power, it redistributes responsibility. The empath is no longer absorbing the emotional cost of the relationship alone. This shift may feel threatening to those who benefited from the old dynamic, but it is necessary for any relationship that claims to be mutual. When empaths stop being endlessly available, they do not create power struggles, they reveal them. They show where emotional labor was uneven, where comfort was prioritized over equality, and where connection depended on one person doing most of the work. This revelation is uncomfortable, but it is also the beginning of relationships that are no longer sustained by invisibility, but by shared presence and shared responsibility. Guilt is one of the most powerful tools keeping empaths trapped in patterns of self-abandonment. It often feels like a moral signal, as if it is pointing to something truly wrong. But in many cases, guilt is not evidence of harm, it is evidence of conditioning. It is the echo of old lessons learned in environments where meeting other people's needs was rewarded, and having one's own needs was inconvenient or unsafe. For many empaths, guilt formed early. They learned that tension in the room was theirs to fix, that disappointment meant they had failed, that harmony depended on their emotional flexibility. Over time, the nervous system associated self-assertion with danger. Saying no did not feel neutral, it felt like causing pain. So guilt became automatic, arising whenever the empath chose themselves, even in small ways. This kind of guilt is not connected to present reality. It is not about an actual wrongdoing, it is a reflex. When an empath sets a boundary, rests, or withdraws, the body reacts as if something terrible has happened. The mind then rushes in to explain the feeling, often by creating a story. I'm being selfish. I'm hurting them. I'm not who I used to be. These stories feel true because the emotion behind them is strong, but the emotion is learned, not factual. Others may unknowingly reinforce this guilt. When people are accustomed to an empath's constant availability, any change can feel threatening. Their discomfort may be expressed as disappointment, confusion, or subtle blame. Comments like, "I guess I can't rely on you anymore," or "you used to care," land directly on the empath's most sensitive conditioning. The guilt deepens not because the empath has done something wrong, but because the old role is being challenged. What makes this particularly difficult is that guilt often masquerades as empathy. Empaths may believe that feeling guilty proves they are compassionate, but compassion that requires self-erasure is not compassion, it is fear-based compliance. True empathy allows space for both people's realities. Learned guilt, by contrast, collapses the empath's inner world in favor of someone else's comfort. When an empath begins to question guilt instead of obeying it, a profound shift occurs. They start to ask, is this guilt pointing to a real harm, or to an old expectation? Often they discover that no boundary was violated, no cruelty enacted. The only thing that changed was access, and loss of access is not the same as loss of care. Guilt loses its authority when it is examined. The empath may notice that the guilt arises even when the decision is reasonable, even when it leads to greater balance, even when it protects their mental and emotional health. This repetition reveals the truth: the guilt is not a guide, it is a habit, a deeply ingrained one, but still a habit. Letting go of learned guilt does not happen all at once. It happens in moments where the empath chooses to stay with the discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. They allow others to feel disappointed without rescuing them. They allow themselves to be misunderstood without over-explaining. Each time they do this, the nervous system learns something new: that boundaries do not equal catastrophe. For those who benefited from the empath's self-sacrifice, this change can feel unsettling. Guilt had been part of the mechanism that kept the relationship functioning as it always had. When guilt no longer works, new patterns are required. Some people will adapt, learning to respect limits and share emotional responsibility. Others will resist, because the old dynamics served them well. For the empath, releasing guilt is not about becoming indifferent. It is about becoming accurate. It is about distinguishing between responsibility and over-responsibility, between care and compulsion. It is about recognizing that feeling bad does not automatically mean doing wrong. Guilt may still appear, especially in moments of growth, but it no longer has to dictate behavior. When an empath understands that guilt is a learned response rather than a truth, they gain freedom. They can choose boundaries even while feeling uncomfortable. They can remain compassionate without betraying themselves. And in that space, something new becomes possible: a life where empathy includes the self, and where choices are guided not by old fears, but by present clarity. Healing does not begin when an empath learns to give better. It begins when they stop disappearing. Self-abandonment is often so normalized that it feels like virtue. Putting others first is praised, endurance is admired. Silence is interpreted as strength, but over time, the cost accumulates. The body holds the exhaustion, the nervous system carries the weight, and the self becomes something that exists only in the background, tending to everyone else's needs. For many empaths, self-abandonment was not a conscious choice. It was an adaptation. They learned early that their feelings created inconvenience, that their needs disrupted balance, that safety came from being agreeable and emotionally available. Over time, they internalized the belief that closeness required self-suppression. To be loved, they had to be easy. To belong, they had to be useful. This pattern follows them into adulthood. They enter relationships already leaning outward, already listening more than speaking, already anticipating rather than expressing. Their inner world becomes secondary, sometimes invisible even to themselves. They may struggle to identify what they want, because they are so attuned to what others need. When they feel discomfort, they override it. When they feel resentment, they shame themselves for it. Self-abandonment becomes automatic. Healing interrupts this automation. It begins not with dramatic change, but with small moments of noticing. The empath becomes aware of the tightening in their body when they say yes but mean no. They notice the fatigue that follows emotional overextension. They begin to recognize that their compassion has been flowing in one direction for a long time. This awareness is often uncomfortable, because it challenges an identity built around being the strong one, the understanding one, the one who never needs much. As healing progresses, the empath starts to experiment with presence toward themselves. They pause before responding. They ask what they feel instead of what is expected. They allow themselves to rest without justification. These acts may seem small, but to a nervous system conditioned to self-erasure, they are radical. Each moment of self-presence weakens the old belief that care must be earned through sacrifice. This shift often changes relationships. When an empath stops abandoning themselves, they are no longer able to maintain connections that depend on that abandonment. Some people will feel confused or threatened. The empath may no longer be as available, as flexible, as endlessly forgiving. This is not because they care less, but because they are no longer betraying themselves to preserve harmony. Healing does not guarantee that others will stay. And that can be one of its hardest truths. Relationships built on self-abandonment often cannot survive self-respect. This loss can bring grief, doubt, and fear, but it also brings clarity. It reveals which connections were rooted in mutuality and which were sustained by imbalance. As the empath becomes more present with themselves, something else changes. Their empathy deepens. It becomes more grounded, less reactive. They no longer rush to fix or rescue. They can sit with discomfort, both their own and others, without collapsing. This is not a loss of sensitivity, it is the maturation of it. Empathy becomes a choice, not a reflex. Healing continues as the empath learns to tolerate being seen in new ways. They may be perceived as distant, different, or less accommodating. They may feel the urge to explain themselves, to soften their boundaries, to return to the old role. But each time they choose self-presence instead, they reinforce a new truth that their inner world matters. When self-abandonment ends, the empath does not become hardened. They become whole. Their relationships, few or different as they may be, are no longer sustained by depletion. They are sustained by authenticity. And in that space, empathy is no longer something that costs them themselves. It becomes something that flows from fullness rather than sacrifice, from connection rather than compulsion, from a self that has finally been allowed to stay